we might ask a question like, if this was your best friend who was saying or feeling the same thing, what would you say to her? How would you feel toward her? So bringing that adult perspective in, bringing adult compassion, adult information, facts. How old were you when this happened? 5? Oh my gosh, 5 years old. Mm-hmm. Stay with that, right? Helping the client to remember that they can't evaluate this little person from their adult sense of wisdom.
In this video, I'm talking with Dr. Debbie Korn about clinical interweave categories. Debbie maintains a private practice in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She is an adjunct training faculty member at the Trauma Research Foundation and is a senior faculty member at the EMDR Institute. Dr. Korn has authored or co-authored numerous articles and chapters focused on EMDR therapy, including comprehensive reviews of EMDR applications with complex PTSD. She is an EMDR International Association approved consultant and is also on the editorial board of the Journal of EMDR Practice and Research. She presents and consults internationally on the treatment of adult survivors of childhood abuse and neglect. Every Memory Deserves Respect, her new book about EMDR therapy, co-authored with Michael Baldwin and written for the layperson, is now available in bookstores and online. Debbie Korn, welcome to the Art and Science of EMDR, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Rotem. Great to be here.
Debbie, I appreciate your time. I know you're busy these days because you just published this book, Every Memory Deserves Respect.
Yes.
And we will talk about this book in a separate interview, but I appreciate your time and willingness to talk today about clinical interweaves. And this is a subject that many EMDR therapists don't really feel comfortable or confident about. Why do you think it is?
Well, I think that the way that cognitive interweaves were taught for so many years, and the way that Dr. Francine Shapiro wrote about interweaves in her books, I think was actually quite narrow, limited. And so folks would learn to do interweaves, and then they would attempt to use the interweaves that they know in any given moment with a client, and often it wouldn't land well, or it wouldn't help the person to move through whatever block processing they were experiencing. And so I think people get gun shy about stepping into the processing. They were taught from early on, stay out of the way, and only step in, if you've got clear-cut block processing. And then if you step in and it doesn't work, people lose confidence in being able to apply interweaves.
Yes. So you extensively wrote, you and Dini Laliotis wrote the section about interweaves in that book, an EMDR therapy primer. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about clinical interweave categories.
Yeah. So we wanted to expand the way clinicians think about interweaves. The interweaves that Francine Shapiro primarily wrote about were informational interweaves, mostly, not entirely, but mostly were informationally focused interweaves, where the goal would be to bring in some piece of information held elsewhere in the brain, or new information, or an adult perspective to help the client transform their thinking and move to the next place. We've expanded way beyond there. And we have all different kinds of categories. So we talk about experiential interweaves, we talk about modulation interweaves, defense interweaves, developmental repair interweaves, so on and so forth. We can go into them in just a few moments. But we wanted to expand beyond informational interweaves, and we wanted to really help the clinician to think conceptually about the function, the purpose of stepping in.
Yes.
Not just kind of randomly stepping in, not prematurely stepping in, but listening for where the client may be blocked or where they may be able to go deeper, may be able to go further in their processing.
Yes, I'm wondering that's, it kind of started answering my next question. In what kind of situations do we need, or do EMDR therapists need to use interweaves?
Yeah. Well, if we think through kind of our categories of interweaves, we need to step in and help when a client is not in their body. They're not grounded in their bodies. They're not grounded experientially.
Mhm.
They are either disconnected from their body, they're shut down, they're hypo-aroused. We need to help them to come from here, come to their senses, and to really notice and be able to put words on their experience. So that's a place where we can step in to bring them back up into that optimal arousal zone. We also need to help folks down regulate when they're hyper aroused, so that they're in that window of tolerance and they can integrate their thinking brain and their emotional brain in the processing, not just be caught in their emotional brain.
Yes.
We need to help clients with defenses when they're stuck in a defensive place and they're not accessing. We need to help folks who are dealing with unmet needs from childhood, situations where they didn't get what they needed to be okay, to flourish. We want to, in those situations, we want to help bring adult wisdom and adult compassion and care into the processing. So again, I could go on, but there's all kinds of opportunities to step in, both to help the client navigate through places where they might otherwise be looping or stuck, but also to help them go even farther.
Yes, thank you for saying that. So I know that there are different categories for different situations, and you started mentioning some of them. So
Yep.
The categories are experiential, modulation, defense, developmental repair, relational, informational, integration, and action.
Yes.
So, which stands for Andrea with double D and double I.
Correct.
Easy to remember. So I'm wondering, Debbie, if you can talk a little bit about each category and what kind of situations we are using each category of interweave.
Yeah. So, and we're going to do this briefly. I teach entire 2-day workshops on this. So we're doing this very briefly. But so I started to mention, so experientially focused interweaves are interweaves where we very briefly step in to say, and where do you feel that in your body? And what's that like to experience that? And what do you notice as you turn your attention to your knee that's vibrating up and down? We're really, again, trying to bring the client from here down to their senses, down to their body. And we're really trying to facilitate mindfulness. So they're very brief little questions or where the therapist might share what they're seeing or what they're sensing to mirror back or reflect back to help the client notice what they otherwise might not be noticing. Yeah. So that's experientially focused interweaves. Modulation focused interweaves are when folks are hyper aroused, right? They're out of their window of tolerance or on the verge of being out of their window. They're having trouble maintaining their dual attention. And we can introduce lots of different things to help them come back into a more regulated. It doesn't mean we don't want them feeling big emotions. Big emotions are fine, but if they're starting to dissociate, if they're having trouble putting words on something, if they're not staying connected to the therapist in between sets, then we need to do something. So we might invite them to imagine something up on a screen at a distance. We might invite them to ground themselves in the moment, or to take a moment and look around the room and name 3 things that are red. So we're utilizing various strategies in the moment to help them regulate more. Defense-focused interweaves, when we see our clients engaging in certain self-protective behaviors in the moment as we're processing, that's keeping them from staying connected to the memory, to the processing, to their bodies. So we might say, could you ask that protective part to step back just for the next few moments?
Yeah.
Could you come back to your body, right? That's both an experientially focused interweave and a defense focused interweave to come back to the body or come back to the affect. So the goal there, again, is to help make the client aware that they're cutting off, that they're pushing away from the experience of the moment, the processing of the moment, and to help them tolerate coming back to it.
Yeah. Debbie, is defense interweave necessarily related to working with parts?
It's not necessarily, in my mind, when we're talking about protective parts, we're talking about defenses. So for anyone that's trained in other parts models like ego state work or IFS, certainly when we are identifying a protective part, finding out what that protective part's concerns are, asking that part if it would be willing to just step back a little bit, you're doing a defense-focused interweave.
Yeah.
What I want to emphasize here, though, if you are doing EMDR, not IFS, not ego state work, but you're in the middle of phase 4 desensitization processing work, you are not going to go into 5 minutes of conversation with this part. That's where people often get lost.
Thank you for saying that. I think that's really important.
You're going to, interweaves are like precision missiles. They're laser beams going right at that place where the client is stuck or where the client needs something. And it's all about keeping the processing going or going deeper and farther with the processing. Right?
Yes.
So that's defense-focused interweaves. Developmental repair-focused interweaves are where we might say to a client, and if you could step into that scene and offer that child something that she never got when she was little, if you could somehow know exactly what she or he needs, what would it be? Can you imagine offering that, doing that for the child, saying that to the child? It's connecting that adult self sitting there in the office with you, with that child self. That often comes very naturally in the work. It comes spontaneously in processing. But if it's not coming, or if there's a block to that or a hesitation, then we can facilitate. We might encourage or invite the client to engage in that kind of work. You might invite the client to bring that child into the present, to feel their love, to feel the safety of the present moment. But again, this is going beyond just decreasing symptoms, and it's really going further into healing and repair.
Absolutely.
Right? Post-traumatic growth is what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
So that's developmental repair. Relational interweaves, we're doing all the time without even thinking about it. I'm just asking people to think about what they bring to the processing in terms of the therapeutic relationship. So we're doing a relational interweave when we say, you're not alone. I'm right here with you. Stay with it. You're doing a great job. It's old stuff. Just know that it's old stuff and you're here with me right in this moment.
Yes.
I'll say to clients, I'm not going to let you drown. I see you. I hear you. Of course you're feeling this. Of course you want this for your younger self.
Yeah, I thank you for saying that, Debbie, because I think that it is important especially for newly trained EMDR clinicians, that part of the relational part, because a lot of times people are being trained to follow the protocol verbatim, and it kind of takes away from that relational piece. So I think it is important to mention that and emphasize it. Right.
Well, our goal at all times is to make sure our client is maintaining dual attention, that they feel safe, that they feel supported, so they can do the work, so their brain can do the work. And so not every client is going to need that. And you're going to test the waters. I always say you try an interweave and you see what happens.
Right.
Because for some clients, you might offer them support. Somebody with a dismissive attachment style may get really uneasy and want to shut down if you say, I'm right here with you. I'm not going to let you drown. I've got you.
Yes.
Right. Somebody else is going to feel completely held in that moment and be able to go deeper.
Yes.
So you need to know your client, you need to know what they need. And then even if you think you know what they need, you're going to try and get feedback on that.
Yes.
So the key, though, is whatever interweave that you're using, you want to be sure that you're not derailing the processing or you're not directing the processing too much. That, you know, this remains a client-led psychotherapy. We're letting the brain lead, we're letting the client lead,
Right.
and we're collaborating, we're facilitating, but we, you know, this is not about having our own agenda.
Yeah.
So anyway, so informational interweaves are the kinds of interweaves that most clinicians are familiar with in light of Francine Shapiro's cognitive interweaves. It's where we might ask a question like, if this was your best friend who was saying or feeling the same thing, what would you say to her? How would you feel toward her? So bringing that adult perspective in, bringing adult compassion, adult information, you know, facts. How old were you when this happened? 5? Oh my gosh, 5 years old. Stay with that, right? Helping the client to remember that they can't evaluate this little person from their adult sense of wisdom.
Yes.
So we ask questions, we provide tidbits of information, we remind the client of what they learned in previous sessions. We ask them to look through their adult eyes. So that's what we're doing for informational interweaves. Integration focused interweaves are where we are asking the client to kind of connect past, present, and future, where we're inviting them after they've had this experience of processing, we're asking them to do a little bit of left brain work to reflect on what they've learned. So, you know, what feels most important to you about the fact that you finally got in touch with that rage toward your father? What feels like the most important thing you learned in recognizing that you were only 5 years old when this happened to you? So we ask questions that really pull at the adult perspective across time and heading into the future.
Yes.
And then the last category is one of my favorites, actually, is action-oriented interweaves. And that's where we're addressing the impulses and the urges to act that remain in the body. So we know that trauma leads to the truncation or the thwarting of certain impulses, fight, flight, active defenses,
Right.
Speaking assertively, speaking truth. And we know that so many of our clients get all kinds of somatic symptoms that reflect that they're still holding experiences in their body, right? That they need to run, they need to fight, they need to scream, they need to say what they need to say to their perpetrator. So action-oriented interweaves are where we, if that's not happening naturally, if it's not happening spontaneously for the client, which it often does,
Right.
we ask the client, you know, what does your hand that's vibrating like this want to do? I noticed that your hand's in a fist. What does your fist want to do? If you could go back into that scene and say what you never said back then, or do what you couldn't do back then, what would you want to do? What would you want to say to your perpetrator? And so we're giving permission, and we're cheerleading, and we're excited for our clients to achieve a sense of triumph as they're able to complete a full cycle of emotion into action that got shut down a long time ago.
Yeah, thank you, Debbie. So that was a very quick overview of the clinical interweaves categories that is in this book. Now, this is the second edition of the EMDR therapy primer. There's a third edition.
Yes. And our clinical interweave categories section is updated in the third edition of Barb Hensley's book. And actually, one of the things that I'm most excited about in the third edition version is that under action-oriented interweaves, we emphasize that action-oriented interweaves can help facilitate action toward the pursuit of justice. And what that means is, you know, and these interweaves came out of working with a lot of clients who were outraged about what was going on in our country in terms of racial strife and political strife. And they had, they were out in the streets protesting injustices at so many levels.
Yeah.
And so in the process of giving clients permission to express or to do, I would often say, let yourself pursue action in the name of justice.
Mm-hmm.
What would justice look like for you? What would you be doing? What would you be saying? And it opened up a whole new level of processing for folks. And I'd always say, this is not necessarily rehearsal for real life. This may not be something you're going to go out and do. And in fact, I'd suggest we're not going there right now. This is really about your healing. In order for you to feel resolved, in order for you to speak truth and have it witnessed, what is it that you want to say or do?
Yes, thank you. Debbie, I want to ask, what kind of mistakes that are common do you see EMDR therapists make when it comes to using interweaves?
I think one thing that I see is jumping in too early, premature interweaves, where the therapist doesn't allow the client to go as far as they can go on their own.
Yes.
And so they're jumping in and kind of starting to direct the treatment. And I would say you really want to see what the client's brain can do, what the client can do. If you're working with a client who you know well, and you know that they always get stuck around anger, or you know that they tend to resort to a certain defense, then you can step in early because you really know your client and you know where they need help. But often we don't know where a client's going, and you want to see. You don't want a client to drop into powerlessness or drop into shame. You want to jump in before they wind up in that pit. But you don't, I see clinicians jumping in with interweaves at the second set of eye movements, or the second or third set of eye. And, you really want to see what the client can do first. So that's number one, is premature. The other would be the opposite end, which is the client is looping, they're dropping into this state of shame, of powerlessness, of, feeling like they can't do EMDR. And the therapist is just stay with that, stay with that. And if a client is in shame and you say, stay with that, they're just going to go deeper into shame, right? When a client has kind of landed in a place of shame, they need our help to, unburden, to lift that shame so the processing can get going again. So that's the other end of it. What other mistakes do I see? I think, as I said earlier, I think rather than seeing an interweave, I often describe interweaves as a raised eyebrow technique, which means all you want to see from your client is a little bit of curiosity about what you're saying or what you're asking. You want to see them say, oh, I never thought of that, or, oh, that's interesting. And then you want to keep going.
Yes.
Right? You don't want to engage in talk therapy. You don't want to engage in psychotherapy about to keep processing, or you want to give them something to try, or you want to give them, a piece of information or an invitation that's new to help them go a next step, or to help them unhook from where they're hooked.
Okay, that was very, very helpful. I have one more question for you, Debbie, and this is a question that I ask every person I interview. How do we get better? How do EMDR therapists get better at doing EMDR therapy? It's definitely there's a learning curve, and there's some skills to be learned. How do we get better?
Yeah, great question. Of course. Well, there's all the obvious answers, which is go to workshops, go to webinars, get consultation, talk with your colleagues. What I would say really makes a difference is practice. Do EMDR therapy with as many clients as you possibly can. Videotape yourself, audio tape yourself. In all of my consultation groups, we watch video every single group. Every person in the group is required to videotape sessions and they present to the group. And I would say when people start videotaping and sharing their work gets better.
Excellent.
Absolutely, without question.
I love
not every client is going to give you permission to videotape, but you need a couple of, you would need a couple of cases that you could videotape. And I would say continue to learn from the masters, both within the EMDR community and outside of the EMDR community. I've spent 30 years training in many, many different trauma-informed, trauma-focused models. You can see the influence of all those different psychotherapy models in these interweave categories in my work. I am true to EMDR. I hold the AIP framework and hold EMDR, but particularly in the preparation phase and particularly in terms of interweaves, I think drawing from concepts and language and strategies from other models can be incredibly helpful. So continue to learn.
Yeah, that was a really, really good answer. I really like what you said, especially about watching videos, learning from our mistakes, from other people's mistakes, and drawing from other modalities. We know that in the last few years we have a lot more integration of parts work. So like you said, ego state or IFS. We have a lot more somatic work, integration of somatic work into EMDR therapy, because we understand the importance of the body and implicit memories and how they're being processed. So
can I add one more thing?
Yeah, of course.
The one additional thought I had is the importance of case conceptualization, case formulation.
Yes.
I think really taking the time to formulate an understanding of the relationship between past, present, and future, to really think carefully of what a client needs, what kind of introductory work, preparation work they need to be able to hit the ground running when it's time to move into the trauma-focused work. That makes a huge difference. And I think learning about dissociation, learning about polyvagal theory, learning what we can learn from neuroscience, I think helps us with case conceptualization, and then we're able to intervene with a game plan in place, not randomly.
Yes, excellent. Debbie Korn, thank you again so much for taking the time and talking to me today about clinical interweaves categories and some other things. And we will talk more at another time about your new book, Every Memory Deserves Respect. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.